It's good to see each one of you here yet. I always marvel at a seminar of all of a sudden you get to the last topic and it's over. And there was weeks and months of preparation. But I trust that as you go from here, it's not over. That you go from here better equipped personally to live a life that glorifies God. And secondarily, better equipped to minister to fellow believers. And even to the unbelievers that we come in contact with. Today, this topic that I'm going to speak on is establishing family boundaries. Maybe the question is, what is a boundary? Have you ever thought about what life would be like if there were no boundaries? A boundary is a line or limit where one ends and another begins. That's a pretty wide open definition, is it not? The sea has boundaries, does it not? Where God said, I've set the bounds of the sea, it can go no further. So one of the things that boundaries do, and this is in a very broad sense, is that they define one thing from another. What is the difference between a block and a brick? A cement block and a brick. There's a description, and when you come to the end of that, of how it fits, and it shifts into another, it is a line. In many degrees, that is a boundary. And today, we're not going to be looking at that type of a boundary, but what I'm saying in saying this is that we are bound by boundaries. They're everywhere. There's different ways of saying it. But the reality is, a line or limit where one thing ends and another begins. Secondly, the Merriam-Webster says this, something that indicates or fixes a limit or extent. GodQuestions.org says this, a boundary is a dividing line in geography, a boundary that which marks the end of one property or jurisdiction and the beginning of another. In interpersonal relationships, a boundary is what divides one person from another, so that each one can have separate identities, responsibilities, and privileges. A boundary creates necessary space between individuals. Healthy boundaries defines expectations and show respect for others. Now within this, there are essentially, when we're shifting into the realm or into the spiritual realm, there's two basic types of boundaries that we're going to find and that we're looking at today. First is moral boundaries. And moral boundaries define what is right and what is wrong. And moral boundaries are unnegotiable. They cannot be negotiated. Secondly, we have wisdom boundaries, and wisdom boundaries exist within moral boundaries. But these are issues such as cultural, different variable elements of relationships, and the list can go on. And these are negotiable. And so it's important as we establish family boundaries, and fathers or mothers, as we fill our roles in the home, that we distinguish between moral boundaries, which are unnegotiable, and wisdom boundaries, which can be negotiated. And what we'll find many times is within situation there's a combination of both. Moral and wisdom boundaries. Secondly is that everyone has boundaries. We all have boundaries. Romans 2:14 says this, "For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do things in the law, these, although not having the law, are a law to themselves, who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and between themselves their thoughts accusing or else excusing them." And so what he's saying here is, within everyone there are boundaries. Every one of us has a sense of right and wrong that's born in us. And that is a boundary. That's an example of boundaries. God has boundaries. The Bible is a book of boundaries. Created beings, men and angels, have boundaries. Have you ever thought of that? And we're bound to those boundaries by design. I'm a human being. And based upon that design, I can only be here now. And if I'm not here, you won't see me up here. Unless, you're watching me via a video conference or something like that. A live stream. But then I'm not there. I'm not here. I'm there. Angels have boundaries. And part of that design also means they're bound by design to the rules that come with that design. Boundaries always existed. Even before creation, there was a boundary in the sense of God knew what was good, what was right, and God knew what was wrong. And in the Garden of Eden, he gave a basic, simple command. Thou shalt not eat of the tree of good and evil, of the knowledge of good and evil. That was a boundary. So boundaries are not the product of sin. But what happened is the fall made them necessary or obvious and necessary. When the angelic beings and man rebelled, what became obvious and could now be seen as the very thing of boundaries of good and evil, right and wrong, and how God established them. And the reality is, the rejection of present boundaries is the embracing of a different one. We can't get away from them. Many times within this, the issue is not, or we think the issue is boundaries, but the issue is not so much that, as the issue is who establishes it. I don't like how you apply something. I'm the one that should be establishing it. That's generally where the issue is. Thirdly, everyone must choose the boundaries they will live by. Have we ever thought of it that way? In Joshua 24, verses 14 and 15, say this. Now therefore, fear the Lord, serve him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the river and in Egypt. Serve the Lord. And if it seem evil to you to serve the Lord, choose for yourself this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land ye dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And so within that, there's a choice. We either choose to abide by the boundaries that God has established, or we choose to abide by the boundaries that I establish. But even then, we can't get away from the reality of there is right, there is wrong. Essentially, we have two options: God or me. That's what it comes down to: God or self. Fourthly, boundaries are important. You see, boundaries define right and wrong. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt and out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. And it continues. Right there we see God saying, here is the boundary. No other gods before me. No other. I alone am God. Boundaries help us develop self-control, and they also teach us submission. And this goes even beyond just boundaries that are issues or moral boundaries of right and wrong. If I have a tendency to overeat, I may set a personal boundary where I may say only, just for example, 1 tablespoon of this, 1 tablespoon of that. I look what's for lunch and this, and that's all I can have, no seconds. Isn't that a boundary? It is. Now, when I'm able to abide by that and do that, what happens? Do I not gain self-control? I do. Boundaries also are important in that they can also help protect us from worldly influences. Boundaries are important because they help us take responsibility for our lives. If I am, let's just say, tying into what I said before about food, if I am overweight, and I say, okay, I need to do something about this. Or I tend to overeat. I say, I need to do something about this. And I establish a boundary. Do you see, in doing that, I am taking responsibility for an area of my life that I know I need to grow in. So boundaries help us take responsibility for our lives. The other thing that why boundaries are important is they play a fundamental role in our salvation and the passing on of our faith. Notice I didn't say they are the absolute. I said they play a fundamental or important role in our salvation. Isn't the Christian life a life of self-discipline? Isn't it a life of self-control? Well, how do we learn that? God just zaps us one day, slaps us upside the head, and we're good to go? No. It's found in by establishing a boundary. Like I said, if I am prone to overeating, I set up basically a plan that says, here's what I'm going to do to control it. Now, 1 or 2 tablespoons of food is not an issue of right or wrong. Is it? No. But we see there a wisdom boundary based upon the knowledge of my personal struggle or our personal struggles. And in that, as I fight that battle with overeating, I gain spiritual strength. Well, doesn't that help me grow spiritually? Yes, it does. Many times we look for the great things, the big things, and in this is where we find the strength to be victorious, and we fail to recognize that he who is faithful in little will be faithful in much. Pick little things and work hard on that, and you'll be amazed how it spreads. Fifthly is all relationships have them. Every relationship has boundaries. Bad relationships or dysfunctional relationships have bad boundaries. Functional relationships have biblical and godly boundaries. Every relationship has them. And within relationships, I kind of liken it to a bubble. You know, when we look at relationships, there are varying levels of relationships. And based upon the level of relationship, there is certain things I liken to a bubble where when someone invades our bubble that is established by the relationship, and they cross what is either traditionally acceptable or is actually acceptable or unacceptable, is we feel violated. It's like, just back off here a little bit. And so within that, there's always a varying degree of where something crosses what is either personally acceptable or actually is unacceptable, biblically. And even within a marriage relationship, there is that degree of, as a husband and wife, where we have to recognize there are certain areas within our relationships that we do not go because of how it affects the other person. That relational, can we say, bubble. Of to cross that to the other, it makes them uncomfortable. How many of you, and especially we'll see this more in cross-gender. How many men here walking in the store would appreciate if a lady walks up to them and gives them a hug? Okay, now notice I did not say that is morally wrong, but there can be and come with that a degree of discomfort. And what has happened is there's a general within each of us, and some of this varies, there is, can I say, that bubble of where when it is crossed, and we're saying, wait a minute, no, don't go there. You follow what I'm saying? And there's a lot of variety of things that factor into that. So all relationships have boundaries. Sixthly, is boundaries can be used in healthy and unhealthy ways. The development of self-control. The illustration I used of a tendency to overeat and the boundaries I established to help guide me in that. That's a healthy way of using boundaries. It's a productive way of using boundaries. Because it's teaching me to control myself, to that my desires are, I control my desires, not that my desires control me. And in that, when boundaries are used in godly or healthy ways, what we find is that God is glorified and others are protected from me. What? Others are protected from me. One of the things of boundaries, and when we use them in healthy ways and proper ways, is that actually it protects people from me. Because I don't know about you, but there's a lot of stuff in me that I don't like. We tend to think of boundaries of protecting me from you. But if that is the emphasis of boundaries, we miss something. Because boundaries also protect people, others, from me. Yes, boundaries also are used to protect me from others. But that's not where we begin. Lastly, is boundaries are often misunderstood. Boundaries are seen as restrictive. You know, to not have boundaries is to be free. Boundaries are guidelines. They're more than just an individual decision. They're not just individual decisions. Boundaries may be distinctly moral or wisdom applications. We often misunderstand them. They're viewed as destructive, harmful, hurtful. They can be. But notice I said there's two ways to use them: productive, healthy ways, or ungodly ways. And a boundary that is established on biblical bases and wisdom principles will be productive. They will not, they feel restrictive, but they're actually can be freeing. They're actually helpful. At its core, the original rebellion of angels and man was a rejection of God's ordained boundaries and the embracing of boundaries established, or what angels, Satan, thought it should be, or what we as men think they should be. And it's made apart from God at its very core. Moving on. I'm going to say here, this is an absolute truth. Now, I know that sounds too absolute, but the reality is there are certain things that are absolute we cannot get away from. I don't care what I think about it, or what you think about it, or what whoever thinks about it, doesn't change it. And that is this: godliness and boundaries are inseparable. Evil is a life lived outside of God-ordained boundaries. Godliness is a life lived within God-ordained boundaries. We cannot get around that. At the heart of us as mankind, and in my heart, at the center of my being, is a constant rebellion. We're fallen. That means the core of our nature will be constantly fighting against God. But praise God, we've been delivered. But yet that potential and that still exists. And so there are many times certain things that we have to say, it's settled. It is settled. And this is one. Godliness and boundaries are inseparable. What makes a home functional is the boundaries by which it operates with, and they're God-ordained boundaries. What creates dysfunction in a home is when we operate by boundaries that are outside of what God has commanded. We cannot get it simpler than that. Practical boundaries. There are two things that biblical boundaries focus on. In Mark 12:29, it says, "The Lord answered him, the first of all the commandments is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. This is the first commandment. The second is like this. You shall love your neighbors yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." Okay, there is one. Biblical boundaries focus on loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. The second one is, how can I love my neighbor as myself? Also, there's a second one that also enters this picture, but it's tied right into the first, and that is, whether eating or drinking or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. So everything and every biblical boundary that we establish is to focus on how can we best glorify God in the establishment of this boundary. What does God say about it? And secondly, tying right into that is how can we foster an environment that enables godly development? Those are the two principles that developing boundaries rest on. Because in those two principles, we have summed out the entirety of the Bible. The whole Bible is summed up in love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. Love your neighbors yourself. That's the entirety of the gospel. That's the 10 Commandments plus. It's all of it. So biblical boundaries focus on how can we best glorify God in this? And secondly, how can I foster an environment that enables godly development? That guides everything. Moving on into establishing boundaries. Basically, okay, this is not real complicated. Remember, one of the things I emphasize is that the gospel is simple. It is simple. If a child can understand it, that tells you the gospel can be reduced to a simple form. And many times we think since we're big boys, we can really make it complicated. But let's keep it simple. And we're going to pick something here. So you can put anything in here. Pick something. I picked curfew. Okay, I'm a dad. And I'm one of those dinosaurs that thinks there's such a thing as curfew. So, we pick curfew. Okay, now what? Secondly is identify the applicable biblical principles. So what does the Bible say about curfews? Any ideas? I didn't find any. That's one. That comes down further down the road, but yeah, we tell them that after we set the curfew. Okay, but if you're looking for something specifically for curfew, you're not going to find it. But what you will find is wisdom principles, not. So in identifying the applicable biblical principles, what we're looking for is identifying, is this a moral boundary that is being established, or is this a wisdom principle or wisdom-based boundary? Common sense tells us that if I have to be at work at 6 o'clock in the morning, it's best to get to bed before 5 o'clock in the morning, right? You follow that? That's a wisdom principle. I have a job, so being responsible means that I need to make sure I get at least some sleep before I go to work. And so what we're seeing there is when we're looking at curfew, it's a wisdom principle. Thirdly, is consider everyone the boundary affects. In this instance, I have to consider myself. Okay, why do I think there should be a boundary? Because the boundary does affect me. It's coming from me, so I'm a part of it. What are the reasons why I think I need a boundary? Now, one of the things I told my children is that, and they don't like this, is that very little good happens after midnight. See, I grew up one time too. Yeah. And while I know nothing good happens after midnight, I know that's not accurate, but I do know the stuff that happened when the crowd size thinned down. I happen to know what happened then. And so then also consider your children. What did you think about this? Well, you can probably guess what they think. But hear them out. What you're doing is you want to hear them. You want to have them included in it. How will it affect? See, this also affects their friends. How will it affect them? Consider that. Within that also is community requirements. Perhaps certain communities have certain, or churches have certain requirements. That enters the picture. Or perhaps the community largely has no curfew. So in other words, we're gaining all the information we can get so that we can develop a good boundary. We know it's not a moral issue, it's a wisdom issue. So in that is where it's even more important to gather a lot of information just to understand as to how best it's applied. And then develop the boundary. And this is where we do find, as a parent, that some biblical principles apply. Fathers, provoke not your children to wrath. Ephesians 6:4. That applies to the development of the boundary. We also recognize that the boundary, but just living that for now, we'll pull that in on the next one, is so we want to be reasonable. We do not want to provoke or instigate rebellion. Give thought to what it will take to enforce it. And so, curfew is midnight, 12 o'clock. And 3 nights a week. And this doesn't include church. So, okay, that's kind of what our curfew is. Midnight, or was. Midnight, 3 events a week, because, children, you do have family. We like to have you around occasionally too. So what you're seeing here is you're pulling in a whole bunch of wisdom principles. And lastly, enforce the boundaries you have established. If you're not going to enforce a boundary, don't even set one. Enforce the boundary. But again, notice this, is some boundaries can be appealed. Notice I said wisdom-based boundaries can be appealed. And so we want to give room for appeals, but don't allow manipulation. And be prepared for pushback, okay? Okay, dads, moms, it's not a threat to your authority if a child doesn't like a boundary you've established. Be a big boy, hear them out without getting defensive. But again, like I said, don't allow for manipulation. And always hear appeals, even if it's happening all the time. After about the 100th time in 10 days, I'm just exaggerating a little bit. It's kind of like, Dad, click, no. Maybe you don't find it's like that for you, but it is for me. No, hear the appeal, no matter how often it comes, and don't answer without hearing them. Because one of the things we're trying to do is we're trying to keep them engaged. And this is opportunities to teach why we've developed the boundary where it is. So recently, in the last year or so, our children that are in the youth talked to us and said, hey, Dad, we now live a half hour away. Youth typically runs till midnight. Can we have a change in curfew? And Yvonne and I talked about it a bit, and I said, okay, 12:30. It's appealable. And also special events. There are certain events that they know that we don't have a curfew. New Year's Eve parties. The youth have a New Year's Eve party. They don't have a curfew. But they also know that when they get home, whatever time it is, Dad will at least, at a minimum, be snoring on the couch. I don't go to bed till the youth are home. And so just there we have it. There's basically how we establish boundaries. Just sorting through, evaluating. And from that, then establishing a boundary. But again, as I want you to note is that moral boundaries are non-negotiable. Boundaries of right or wrong we cannot negotiate with. Practical boundaries, spiritual boundaries. Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9, he says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And these words, skipping down to, he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And then he goes on to say in a wordy way of saying, have God everywhere. When you sit down, when you raise up, when you talk, when you walk, on your hand. In other words, you get the picture, of what he's trying to say is that wherever you go, have God with you. Have reminders there. Do things, have things that remind you of God is here. And so that's the point or purpose of spiritual boundaries. And the goal, according to Deuteronomy 6, is we want to saturate our homes and lives with God and His Word. Some of the ways we can do this is, for us as individuals, is personal devotions. A daily moment set apart to remember God. And for some of us, now for me and my work, being what it is, there's lots of reminders, and we work with the gospel. That's my job, and working with people. And so I am more immersed in it based upon my job than other people. But for many people, for the average person, this is the only time when is set aside solely to focus on God. And so make sure that in some way or another that we have time set apart to meditate, to read Scripture, to focus on God. Because we're to be immersed in it. It's supposed to be all around us. And if we don't take the time for it, how does that happen? It doesn't happen. I see here it's a command. We're commanded to do this. Immerse and saturate our world and our homes with God. Family worship. It's a daily moment for parents to teach their children about God. It's an opportunity to discuss personal beliefs and practical applications, to have that discussion, that back and forth of an exchange of ideas or differences of opinions. It enables a wide range of spiritual discussions. Another thing that I think is very important is church attendance. I found it interesting when you read the context of Hebrews 10 there. We'll read it. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. Okay, this is the context it's given in. For he who promised is faithful, and let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, and not forsaking the assembling together of ourselves, as is the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much more as you see the day approaching. One of the things about church attendance is it's another way to keep ourselves within and to be reminded of our faith. Obviously, there are times and places it's not possible, but that's not the norm. Notice I didn't say church membership. Well, I think that's important too, but I said assembling together with fellow believers is important. Relational boundaries. Now, one of the things I think this is important to recognize is that this applies to all relationships in the home. In the home. A married child is not a part of your home. They have their own home. So when we talk of these relational boundaries, we recognize that I'm speaking for my home. My children that are married have their home. And they have to therefore establish that theirs may be a little different. But it applies to my home. All boundaries or relational boundaries in the home must conform to biblical principles. Any boundary that violates biblical principles cannot be obeyed. Did you hear that? Any boundary that I establish as a father that violates biblical principles cannot be obeyed if they're going to be faithful to the Lord. So what I have to recognize is when I establish a boundary and a relational boundary, it has to be based upon God's word. As I said before, the 2 points. And if I establish a boundary as a father that violates God's standard, my wife and my children are authorized by God to disobey it. So all relational boundaries within the home must conform to biblical principles. We're to be respectful. Fathers, honor your wife. Husbands, honor your wife and defend her authority at all times. It is possible to acknowledge a spouse's failure and still protect them. We're to be mothers, respect your husband and protect his authority and leadership. And one of the things that mothers have to watch out for is when a child comes to you about dad. It's important to acknowledge within both of these, fathers or mothers, husbands and wives, is acknowledge failures, but always point them to personal responsibility. They will not give an account to God for what dad did. They will give an account to God for what they did. And so it's important to navigate that where we don't undermine the authority of a spouse, but we point them to what does God call you to do. Be kind. I have never seen kindness start a fight. Has anybody here? You know, brother, I really appreciated what you did today. Pow. I mean, kindness doesn't start fights. Be kind. We're to be kind to each other. Fathers, mothers, children. We're to be kind in speech and actions. We're to be kind in touch. Obey authority. One of the things we see within relational boundaries of a home is that there has to be obedience to authority. We are to obey authorities. And the reality is within this, husbands, there are times where you submit to your wife. When I as a husband had delegated authority to my wife, in those areas where I have delegated authority to her, I submit to her. Now that doesn't remove my position in the home. It simply recognizes that when I give authority to someone, I honor that authority. You know, if I'm the owner of a company and I give a general manager authority in areas, it only works if I allow that manager to exercise the authority I've given him. Now, there may be times where I say, wait a minute, I'm not sure we should go there. But husbands, you have to give your wife and allow her to exercise authority that not I have given her, but that God has given her. Parents, who do you think you are if you think you can disobey authority, but your children have to obey authority? If I, as a parent, don't have to obey authority, I cannot expect my children to obey authority, and that includes me. Children, parental respect for authority doesn't free you from obedience. One of the things we often forget is the fact that the gospel, the New Testament, was written in an era where it was dictatorship. The Roman empires weren't great people. You read the history of Rome, it's intriguing. They had some real interesting characters that were leaders. And we have to be respectful here. We could use different words that would be very fitting. And it's in that era of a dictatorship or dictatorship that the Bible is written, and it says, obey your authorities. Unless there's a violation or they command you to violate biblical principle. Lastly in that is serve willingly. You say, what does serving willingly have to do with, or is a relational boundary in the home? The reality is, I'm giving you a general boundary that is essential in the function of a home. If people do not serve willingly, the home is going to fall apart. How willing are you to serve? Husbands or fathers, to clear the table, to wash the dishes, to pick up the trash. If you see a little bit of dirt on the floor, to sweep it up. A relational boundary in the home, and this applies to individually, is God has commanded me to serve willingly. We're called to serve. Love your neighbors yourself. That's serving. Moral boundaries in the home. In 1 Corinthians 6, verses 18 through 20, says this, flee sexual immorality. And we're going to stop right there. I don't need to say more. Flee sexual immorality. And when we're looking in particular here at moral boundaries in the home, I'm looking at boundaries pertaining to sexuality and proper boundaries in regarding to sexuality. And some of the things, an example of what happens when this is not applied or they're violated is King David. Do you think King David thought that when he committed adultery with Bathsheba, he would not end up killing someone? I doubt it. I'm sure he didn't. Do you think he realized that this act of adultery and murder of Uriah would bring about the deaths of 4 of his sons? And so we see when we come to the realm of moral boundaries is these things are largely non-negotiable. Now, in application, there can be some negotiation, if you understand what I mean by that, as to what is modest. But the thing of moral boundaries is they are not negotiable. We need to have and must have moral boundaries in our home. And just some examples is night clothes. Nighties need to be modest. And I'm talking of, especially with children, when you have children sleeping together, it is important that clothes are modest. That there is, at least for boys, shorts and a shirt is what we typically have. This is how they're to be sleeping. No sleeping in just underwear. For boys to be out, or girls, for boys to be out just in the house, we say we want them wearing either long sweatpants or pants and a t-shirt. Girls, if they have their nightie on, they need to be wearing a house coat or something. Because what we're establishing is we're protecting the sanctity, one, of sexuality, and two is protecting from the effects of what happens when there are moral violations. Because we do not know the extent of those effects. David did not know what his sin with Bathsheba would bring about. Rebellions, sons attempting to overthrow him, rapes, murders, all flowing from his sin. Another thing that is a good moral boundary or a boundary is one person in a bedroom or bathroom when showering or getting dressed. Control the amount of time that children spend in the bathroom or bedroom, and this even can apply to us as parents as well. Boys stay out of sisters' bedrooms and purses. In other words, our boys know they're not allowed to go in their sisters' bedrooms. And vice versa. Obviously, a girl in the home may be putting wash away. Okay, but beyond that, no, you stay out. Don't allow inappropriate content or suggestive language in the home. It's amazing what we allow in our home. For those of you who perhaps may allow movies, what you allow in the home. Have you ever thought about that? If someone would come in your home and be cursing and swearing, what would you do? But many times within movies, if people allow movies, there's a lot of stuff that comes in that we would not allow otherwise, and we don't give a thought to it. Music, magazines. One of the things I could never figure out is, what does a woman in a bikini have to do with a car? Automobile magazines. What does a woman in a bikini have to do with a car? I thought this was a automobile or a car magazine. Do you get the idea of what I'm saying? We don't have magazines. We don't have hunting magazines. We don't have car magazines. Why? Because so often there's things in there that are not appropriate. One of the things I think is good too as a family, obviously within appropriate ways, is to discuss sexual vices. In other words, when something hits the news about a person, perhaps a pastor having an affair, a minister having an affair, talk about it, obviously in appropriate ways, because it's an opportunity to teach. Public immorality, things like that. Those are things to talk about. Obviously, we have to discuss them discreetly and properly. But the idea is, while we want to protect our children, we also want to prepare them for what is actually out there. And obviously, there's a lot of things that come into that as well. Age, that kind of thing, we definitely would factor into that. Avoid cross-gender back rubs, etc. A brother giving a sister a back rub, no. Sister giving her brother a back rub, no. Parents, show affection in appropriate ways. In other words, as parents, we're to model affection in appropriate ways, because we're teaching them what actual biblical love and affection looks like. And never discuss. Okay, let me back up. Be very careful in discussing intimate relational problems with children. Okay, I'm backing off the never, but I don't encourage it. Typically, unless it's adult children that are an age where they can actually manage and sort through it, typically it's best to someone outside of, to do that with someone outside of the family. But be very careful with that. Because you do not realize the damage a mother or father does when they talk to a son or daughter about issues they have with their intimate relationship. Especially if they're in their teens or early 20s, when they have not yet sorted out all of those things. And it's important also to address moral issues, father to son and mother to daughter. And occasionally, depending what it may be, it's appropriate for a father and mother to talk to a daughter about something. And I'm not opposed if a mother and father talk to a son about an issue. But address moral issues, father to son, mother to daughter, I would say is a general rule of thumb. And sometimes, obviously, in a mother and working with a daughter on something, I think it's necessary and it's appropriate to include a father, but we need to be sensitive to how things like that are handled. And there could be much more said. But keeping moving on here, technology and social media. And I'm not going to read the text there, but I will say this. Proverbs 4:23 says this, guard your heart above all else, for it determines the course of your life. And when we get into social media, it's important to recognize the issue of the heart. It's important to recognize that technology, computers, cell phones, or social media are not different than your fingers, than your hand, than your eye, is that they are simply extensions of the heart. And so to cut off technology, to cut off social media, I'm not saying you don't do that, okay? That's a choice you can make. But to do so as the only means misses the point. The issue is not, I could lay my phone up here and we could sit here all day, and what would happen with that phone? Nothing. But it's me that operates it. And so it may be necessary at times to say, I will not have a smartphone because of my struggle. But just eliminating it misses, on that basis, on just the fact of it's dangerous, may miss the heart. And we have to realize that moral problems existed before smartphones. It's just the extent was limited as to where it could be reached. So with all tech with internet access should be password protected. And parents know the passwords for all cell phones in the house and all computers. And they may be, for computers, be the only ones that know the password. And computers, cell phones, I think it's important that we use them in public places in the home. In other words, limit computer use, limit cell phone use to public areas. Phones don't belong in bed. They're not necessary there. Parents, you too. Be an example. Establish accountability. Parents, regularly check in with your children and start young. Don't use tech as a babysitter. Make them play. Make them go outside. Do things. And our one grandson is in speech therapy, and they marvel at how he plays. Why? Because he doesn't sit in front of a TV. He doesn't sit on the phone. He's playing and doing things. And that is so important in natural development. Use accountability blocks or filters. I personally use Covenant Eyes. And then combine that with a smartphone or with an iPhone. And the thing is, there's a lot of flexibility with them and how you set them up. But there's something to remember, which we'll kind of pull together at the end with them, with accountability filters. Pinwheel's another one. That's an iPhone and filter combination. But the goal of the filter is to protect the innocent and the weak. You follow what I'm saying with that? The goal of a filter is to protect the innocent and the weak. If a person wants to get around a filter, they will. So a filter, and my purpose in setting up filters and how I set it up is basically to protect the person from innocent encounters with pornography, etc. Or the person that is struggling morally from their weakness. But if they want to get around it, they can. And I can't help them in that. And then also with that, I do like parental controls on the iPhone. I use that, so I'm familiar with the iPhone. Basically, when my children get a phone, is they cannot download or delete apps. And also, don't allow messages to be deleted if you at all can. Have things set up that messages are not deletable, that they are reserved, or at least they can be accessed. And also, it's then important to set up parental controls according to your knowledge of the child. So each child may have a different setup based upon their weaknesses and struggles. In social media, understand social media. It's important that we actually understand in some limited degree social media. Social networking apps such as Facebook, Twitter, those are social networking apps. You have the photo sharing apps like Instagram and Pinterest. Now, obviously, some apps kind of do both, but this is kind of a general category as to what these apps were designed to do. Video sharing apps are obviously things like YouTube and TikTok. Now, with video sharing with their sharing, it's sharing, reporting, and commenting on the video. So there's a lot more interaction with YouTube and TikTok. Interactive media also includes TikTok or Snapchat. And what they offer is a high level of interactions, and that they commonly, or have a high level of interactions, get to the right spot, and encourage video sharing, video and photo sharing. Okay, these are what these apps tend to do. That's more of their design. And then you have community building sites or blogging sites such as Tumblr and Reddit, and there's more. Know what an app does and what it's used for. So it's important to do that, to know that. And then also know the platform, and this includes the app, just a simple different way of looking at it, and research it before using. Avoid apps with higher level of explicit content. Tumblr, Reddit, X, Snapchat, TikTok, Discord, Telegram, MeWe, Badoo. Some of you probably never heard of them. I didn't either till I had actually studied and presented a topic on social media. But avoid these apps because these apps will have higher levels of inappropriate or explicit content. Be cautious with apps that promote random or anonymous interactions or that have minimal privacy controls. In other words, you want to be able to set it up that it limits who can actually reach out to this person, to you. You can set it private. That means only people that you approve as friends can actually interact with you. And avoid dating apps. Okay, Tinder, Bumble, eHarmony. These are dating apps. I'm not saying eHarmony is supposed to be a Christian site, that it's not wrong. But the point is what? And especially Tumblr is one that I really, if you ever notice, when you get into studies of the gay realm, transgender realm, Tumblr is a popular one. In social media, I think it's important to manage the risk. At a minimum, if we say, no social media, that's fine. That's a legitimate choice. But if we're going to have social media, we have social media, we have to recognize that it comes with an incredible risk. And so we need to set up boundaries that manage that risk. And some of the ways we do this is limit the platforms you use. WhatsApp and Facebook, for example. You don't need Facebook, Instagram, et cetera, et cetera. They're kind of the same thing. So Facebook, limit, perhaps say just, I'm just going to have WhatsApp and Facebook. We don't need all these different messaging apps. My children come home and they say, oh, Dad, we need this app. And the latest one, this goes back a little bit, but Be Real. I said, you gotta be kidding me. Be Real? Did you ever watch someone do a Be Real? Be Real time. It's kind of like they stop fighting. They make sure their hair looks good. They position themselves just right, and they take a Be Real. I'm not anti-social media, okay? But what I'm saying is, that's a whole different subject. We don't need a lot of apps. The more apps we have, the more time we waste on them. And we're commanded as Christians to redeem the time, to use our time wisely. We have Facebook, we have Instagram, and the only reason we have that is because we also hobby breed dogs, and that's a good way to actually contact or get in touch with people that are interested in puppies. Set daily time limits. In other words, say, personally say, I'm only going to be on here so much time a day. And if needed, lock it down. Limit ways or places that you can access social media. So perhaps it may only be, in the morning, I will check Facebook, I will check Instagram for if there's any contacts about puppies or that kind of a thing. And then that's it. Or in the evening, we'll check for any contacts. That's it. That's all. And parents, again, especially when it comes to social media accounts, it's so important, again, to lock down phones that they cannot. Obviously, that there's a point where I unlock the phone and say, you're an adult now. But know what apps they have. Know what social media apps they're using. In closing, remember this: boundaries cannot save you. That does not mean boundaries are not important, but we cannot be saved by boundaries alone. Boundaries are a part of what guide us and protect us, but we're saved by Jesus Christ alone. And to rely on boundaries only, and to miss ourselves, our hearts, we'll end up where we don't want to be. Boundaries cannot save you. Secondly, boundaries will not deter the rebellious. So we don't put boundaries in place to stop rebellion. It's not going to work. They do not deter the rebellious. And lastly, moral boundaries help us identify right and wrong. Wisdom-based boundaries help protect us from the dangers within and without. You see, boundaries protect others from us, but boundaries also protect ourselves from ourselves. As you go from here, recognize as parents, or even as a single person, the roles that boundaries play in your walk with the Lord, and seek Him. God bless.